Yeah, I think the message is we have to get aggressively active, like every day of every week of every year, on our present economic system in particular, on the fossil fuel corporations, and on our governments, who not only support the fossil fuel corporations, they are pushing for more and more fossil fuel extraction and combustion.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to another Climate Emergency Forum. My name is Regina, and I'm your host. We'll be discussing COP27 with this special recap coming on the heels of Sharm El-Sheikh, Egypt. And for me, the defining moment of the COP was the opening statement by António Guterres when he said that humanity is on a highway to climate hell. And I think that this was a very important way to start the COP. He said further that we are in the fight of our lives and we are losing. And our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible. We are on the highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator. Yeah. And I guess you could say that set the tone for the entire COP, at least it did for me. This was the COP that was supposed to be focusing on youth, focusing on solutions. They called it the implementation COP. It was also the COP that was going to address climate justice, or as what they say, loss and damages, or also referred to as climate reparations. So different people will have different things to say on how far we got on those topics. I myself did make the time to speak to quite a few young people within the COP. And I will say that they were, as young people are wont to be, they were positive. They were not negative. They felt that there was still hope. And that was on one hand very inspiring, and on the other hand quite poignant, because I can't say that I shared the same degree of hope. However, as a grown-up, I'm certainly not going to tell them there's no hope. You never ever want to do that to young people, especially when we've left them with this legacy. However, as I say, it was poignant, and they're in the fight of their lives. And of course, we're there to help as well. We should be. Also, in terms of climate reparations, I think that we have just kicked the can down the road one too many times. And I think that this year is no exception, especially when we saw what happened in Pakistan with those enormous, monumental, biblical floods. There's very little by way of help, aid that is going to these countries. Yes, some has been offered, but it's not offered in a sense of this is for you to help your country to recover, to mitigate, to adapt. There's a lot of strings attached. There are, and I think that we may hear this from some other members on the panel, a lot of this aid comes in the form of loans. How is it that the major emitters of the world, when they offer help to the countries who are suffering the greatest, offer help in a way that is going to once again profit them? Because what is the purpose of a loan but to make a profit? So in my mind, there was much to regret. I feel as though it was a lost opportunity, but I hope that my view is the minority view. One other thing I'd like to mention is I found the interfaith community to be really inspiring as well. And that's a segment of people in the world that we really, really need to hear from, that really need to step up. Something like 80% of humanity ascribes to some type of faith group. And I think if those groups could come together and form a collective, it would be a powerful, powerful force for humanity and the planet and the living beings on it. So I hope that my perspective, which is kind of down, is in the minority. And I would like to now hear from Dan Galpern.
Thank you very much, Regina. I was not at COP27 this year. This is the first one that I've missed in 5 years. I needed to stay back in the United States to prepare our lawsuit against the United States for not doing enough about climate. And our statutory deadline was right smack in the middle of COP27. But I did follow developments and have some thoughts as well. And I don't really disagree with you, Regina, alas, with respect to your overall assessment. I do think that it was important and interesting that the major emitting countries agreed to the new loss and damage fund, even though commitments were not strong in terms of actually providing resources for that fund. But the agreement in principle that the major emitting countries are obliged to assist the hardest hit nations from climate disaster to help pay for their recovery. It seems obvious. It's long overdue, but it's good that it happened. But of course, the devil is in the details, including what will happen at COP28 and further, whether the major emitting nations will actually provide substantial resources to ensure that that fund can work well. Climate-related disasters are only going to mount as time goes on, unless we get serious about the mitigation of climate change. And it is there that I think COP27, as in the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change meetings in the past, has most robustly failed. And that failure was part of a struggle to assert the right to continued use of fossil fuels, unimpeded largely by the pledges made through the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, which, according to a study by the United Nations, probably the fourth in a row emissions gap report that they issued right before COP27. The United Nations Environmental Program noted that pledges to date, as well as action to date to meet those pledges, have not put us on track for success. We're still well behind the eight ball. And so there was a number of calls at COP27, including by India, to actually urge a phase down of fossil fuels. And here's the one bright spot, and I'll end with that here. That ultimately it didn't succeed because of the implacable opposition of Russia and some of the Middle Eastern countries, including Iran and the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. But John Kerry, suffering from COVID, no less, did note that the United States strongly supports a phase down of unabated fossil fuels, and we could talk later about what it even means to think about an abated fossil fuel or not. But the United States, the world's historical largest emitter, there came out in favor of a phase down, not only of coal, but also of oil and gas. That's an important major step forward. And if that is actually followed up with changes in policy along those lines, as is possible, I think, under existing United States law, so long as we can enforce it, well, then that could harbor some real progress in succeeding conferences of the parties.
Thank you so much, Dan. I will say, for my part, you were missed. I appreciate your thoughts on losses and damages, too little, too late, and the bright spot as you see it in terms of U.S. ramping down the use of fossil fuels. We'll see how that plays out. And Paul, you were there, so I'd like to hear your thoughts on COP Recap, COP27.
Yes, thank you, Regina and Dan, for your comment. So I always think of these COPs as like the phrase, a tale of two COPs comes to mind, because we have the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations that seem to be occupying one section. And then we have the governments of the world who bring, a large contingent of policy people, political people, members of parliament in Canada's case. But they also bring a lot of people from the corporate world. They bring actually lots of people, lots of fossil fuel lobbyists in particular, but also lobbyists from other large corporations. And in fact, this COP was a very large one. The claims were 30,000, maybe 40,000 people. And there were 600 to 700 or more fossil fuel people there. And this happens every year. These people are invited by the countries. And there's very little interaction between the non-governmental organizations, people, and the governments, the countries. There's very, very little interaction. In fact, most of the meetings, the policy meetings, the high-level meetings are accessible only by the countries and people, that the countries bring. The NGOs are not permitted. There are media people also that are permitted, but not all of them. So this is a big problem. I mean, the COP is supposed to be for solving. I think people forget what the COP is supposed to be. It seems like it's a huge trade show. It's a huge exhibit show. It's, lots of people go and take extra time for vacation, etc. We have these meetings year after year, and there's usually one theme, and both Regina and Dan have mentioned the loss and damages or climate justice, climate reparations. None of that is going to solve the actual root core problem of the fossil fuels. I think the theme of every single COP, should be the central theme, should be reducing fossil fuel emission, should be looking at the science of the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. If they're still going up, they're going up at record levels after 27 COPs. They're going up now at record levels. And, I didn't even see I saw the Keeling curve of CO2 in a couple different places, a couple different booths, but I mean, that curve should be on every, splattered all over. And it's going up at record levels. Therefore, the warming is going up at record levels. Therefore, the climate is destabilizing at record levels, and it's going to hit our global food supply very, very soon. And, this is an emergency situation. And once again, these huge events just don't seem to reflect that urgency. It was a little bit restricted, I thought, in being in Egypt. People knew that their free SIM cards could be monitored by the government in terms of access to your phone, access to your emails, access to your video camera on your phone, and GPS tracking as to where you went. And that kind of puts a damper on, probably it made a lot of people there that would normally want to protest and so on, self-regulate and be careful about what they said. And that's not the best environment to have such a thing. The COPs are valuable for a number of different reasons, in that they get, there's major press on the events. It keeps climate change in the news. But, the language still at the conference largely avoids slamming fossil fuel companies and slamming emissions, because there's so many lobbyists there. The language sidesteps them and says, yeah, climate change is the real problem, but they don't really say the root cause, which is the rising emissions. Personally, I always get a lot out of the COPs from networking, learning, always a lot of Arctic climate science. I learned from that particular booth and on NOAA satellites. And, you get to meet famous people, you get to network. You get to educate some of the people that you bump into on how serious climate change is. So personally, yeah, so I have always mixed feelings about a COP, but you know, it's absurd to me that in 2022, here we are, and emissions are still skyrocketing. So climate change is getting worse than it's ever been at any time in the past.
Well, thank you so much, Paul. And you couldn't have ended on a better note, because I'm going to hand it over to Peter. And I know that drumbeat with Peter, got to bring those emissions down. So Peter, what are your thoughts on COP27 recap, Sharm El-Sheikh?
Well, okay, I'll try and follow your example and look for something positive in the COP27, and particularly, of course, in the plan, as Regina said, you know, the so-called implementation plan from COP27. Yeah, looking for something positive is quite a challenge. It's very hard. I'll start with 2 points. The world has been negotiating now for nearly 30 years on whether, you know, we'll have a safe climate. The end of the preamble of the 1992 convention was determined to preserve the climate for future generations. Well, obviously, after 30 years, the world is doing exactly the opposite. So what could we say that's positive? Well, I did notice that there was some direct quotes from the sixth assessment of the IPCC, with some pleasant surprise in view of what happened in previous COPs. And the most important one to me is a statement they made on energy. So this is from the outcome document statement. And they say emphasizes the urgent need for immediate, deep, rapid, and sustained reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions by parties across all sectors. Now, despite the fact that obviously the COP decided to allow the green light to continue and permit more and more and more fossil fuels to be extracted and burnt, that really is very useful, because that's something that activists and people like ourselves can now repeat and use it to really, really push progress in next COP, or hopefully before the next COP. So that was good. However, again, we had what has been referred to as weasel words, and my apologies to weasels. I think they're quite nice little creatures. So what we had was, we had invitations, we have acknowledges, we have recognizes, we even have call upon parties. Well, we've had that for 20 years at least. If you read an outcome document from one of these COPs 20 years ago, it would be very hard to find any difference to this COP27. I got to point that out. Now, when it came down to the nitty-gritty of actually doing something on loss and damage, and actually doing something on mitigation, the language was consider. So after 30 years, the governments of the world are going to perhaps consider to do what is morally and certainly ethically right for our very survival, and also to honor the statements. You know, Dan will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that there's something in the 1992 convention which says that no subsequent legislation, regulation, whatever, can override the convention, which really is what I see that these governments, powerful, rich, wealthy, fossil fuel producing, supporting governments, have been doing with terrible success for the past 20 years. So my final thing that I'll say is that it was quite a triumph that fossil fuels were mentioned for the second time in a COP. Thank you very much, everybody. However, the terminology, of course, again, was the terminology that was kind of forced on everybody at the very last minute in Glasgow. You remember that absolutely dramatic last minute intervention. And so what COP27 is, and this is where the call upon parties comes in, to continue efforts for accelerating efforts, no less, for the phase down of coal power, which really means absolutely nothing, right? I mean, everybody knows that coal burning has to stop, like today, actually yesterday, years ago. And then there was a very interesting thing on the fossil fuel. And I was very glad to see fossil fuel subsidies mentioned again. I mean, that's taken 28 years. they had phased out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Now, I would need to get advice from experts on this, but I understand that what inefficient means is that in actual fact, the impacts, environmental impacts on the planet and the future of fossil fuel subsidies is not going to be actually counted. They're only going to count in how efficient this is for the world economy, which is wrecking the planet and stealing the future from all the world's children and future generations. So I'd be interested in that.
Thank you so much for bringing up that point. And I wonder if, Dan, if you might have an answer to the question that Peter just posed.
About the meaning of efficiency with respect to fossil fuel subsidies? No, I don't. And one of the reasons weasel words like this are utilized is that it enables everyone to have their own interpretation of the word and thus agree to final communique and take some pride, or we made a breakthrough, but then when it gets right down to it, some of these provisions are essentially meaningless. Look, what the science indicates clearly is that we need to not only get rid of inefficient subsidies for fossil fuels, but we need to rapidly phase out, not down, phase out of fossil fuels. Now, this can't be done overnight. The world is highly dependent on it, but it needs to be done with all deliberate speed, as rapidly as one can do, so as to avoid, an untenable situation where we have climate change proceeding out of human control and inducing, an economic calamity that would be visited on most regions of the planet. And this is understood. In fact, it was even understood by a number of the nations, and yet the COPs have become an arena for bargaining over smaller issues. And so I wholeheartedly agree with Paul and Peter's call for, getting back to basics. Is this going to be a process that helps preserve a viable climate system in this planet or not? That will need to be decided in COP28 in Dubai.
Okay, I can't help but notice, Peter, that you kind of scoffed at the COP28 in Dubai. I just wanted to call you on that and wonder if there was a message in that.
Yeah, I think the message is we have to get aggressively active, like every day of every week of every year, on our present economic system in particular, on the fossil fuel corporations, and on our governments, who not only support the fossil fuel corporations, they are pushing for more and more fossil fuel extraction and combustion. That's my feeling. And then maybe if we were to do that, and that would mean to have a lot more people, like us, if I may say so, to get really, really active out there. And then maybe something might happen in the next COP.
Paul, final thoughts?
Yeah, final thoughts are, okay, if there's like 30, 40,000 people attending COP27, and now this week and next week is the Convention on Biodiversity, which is called COP15 in Montreal, and they say there's like 20,000 odd people. Most countries have sent delegates, and this is all to hammer out biodiversity. So hopefully maybe they have a bit more luck in getting some hard and fast commitments to protect life on the planet. So it's not just about climate change, it's about all biodiversity and the causes for loss. So lots of people are talking about it. Maybe we should have these meetings just on Zoom between 200 people, each person a decision maker in each different country of the world, and have them meet every month until they come up with some decent stuff to reverse the course that our planet's heading on. Maybe that would be a much better way of dealing with this.
Maybe that would be a much better way. Put them in a room, lock it, and they don't come out until they all agree. I like that idea. And I will close with the final words of our fearless leader, António Guterres. He says, a window of opportunity remains open, but only a narrow shaft of light remains. The global climate fight will be won or lost in this crucial decade on our watch. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have to do all we can, as Peter says, and as we all have said, every day, every week, every month, every year, in this final decade, this deciding decade of our planet and our life on it. So you out there who are watching, I would love to hear what thoughts you have on this, what you will do in this crucial decade. And I hope that one of the things that, if you haven't done it yet, will be to like, share, and of course, subscribe. It's good to see you all, and I look forward to seeing you again on the next Climate Emergency Forum.